Hello and welcome to week 11. It's getting close, Summer's here. I think it is. Knocking on the door at least. Getting warm out there, and what this means is you really need to start paying attention to the final project, the information literacy paper and the service learning paper. So if you have questions about those or you're still wondering, I think there's some people I still have not heard from about those. Those are required to pass this class. They're worth a huge amount of points. So it's very important that you get those things done. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to talk about emotions, I think. We're going to talk about motivation and emotion today, like the motivation it takes to get those projects done. So let's get started on chapter 10, and we're going to be also doing chapter 11 this week, so here we go. Chapter 10 is on motivation and emotion, what psychology tells us about that. And the first question that I ask you is one of those questions that's out there: does money buy happiness? And the research sort of indicates that, in fact, not so much that individuals with money actually buy happiness or buying things brings about happiness, but people with more wealth tend to be happier. In my particular view, I think money doesn't buy happiness, but it certainly pays off a lot of unhappiness. So it'd be like, get rid of all that. But having the means to be able to do the things that you like to do apparently is connected to happiness. And so there's some pretty good evidence that individuals who manage their money are able to meet their bills, work hard and all that stuff, and they have money, are happier than individuals that don't. So in truth, there is a relationship between money and happiness. Spoiler alert. I probably should have put that before. Spoiler alert, there actually is an answer to that question. So I want you to take a look at these words that are coming up on the screen, and you'll see that they're related to each other. You have motion, motivation, immovable, emotion, all of these things. And each one of them actually arises from the Latin word movere, which means to move. So emotions, that term, that phrase, is the aspect of the human experience that causes us to act. That's why it's related to motivation. We have that each is what's going to move. And we all know, let's say you have to make a change in your life, and you can understand that very easily, that, X and Y has to change, or I'm not going to be well, I have to quit smoking, or I'm, going to die early. You may understand that, but until there's some sort of emotion or motivation component to that, the action doesn't happen. So emotions are considered almost like an energy source, or a force pushing us in a particular direction. And we feel them that way. When we are struck by, let's say, the time in Bambi when Bambi's mother is killed by the hunter, and if we are stricken by emotions, we are moved by that. A song comes along and it's a sad song, reminds us of a sad event. We are moved by that. So that actual sense of psychological movement is how we get these terms such as motivation and emotion. Now, in the big scheme of things, there's lots of emotions, and they're lots interrelated with each other. And this graphic does a pretty good job of giving us an understanding about how different aspects of emotion are experienced in relation to each other. So just look at the top one, the yellow petal on this flower. We have ecstasy, an extreme sense of happiness. Then you have joy and serenity. And then on the outside of that, you have optimism and love. So you see how these are related to one another in terms of intensity and maybe a global effect in terms of our lives. And I'll notice that I put some red circles here. Inside of these red circles are what we consider the basic emotions. These are the ones that manifest in the first few years of life: joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. And as we learn the intensities of those, they get deeper, and you can see ecstasy, admiration, terror, amazement, those going around there. And then as we mature, we see them going outside, and we see serenity, acceptance, apprehension, distraction, those kinds of ways in which these emotions work together. So quite a variety of different feelings that we have, but they are related to one another. And sometimes they might be they're close to each other. So we look at joy, let's say, for example, is sort of next to anticipation. But look at where the next one over, we have anger. So anger near anticipation, like what if something doesn't, we're waiting for something. We're really looking forward to meeting someone at a restaurant, and we're going to have joy with that. We're anticipating, but then they're late. And we start, I'm not going to get my needs met. And that you can see how that leads to that other emotion, anger, just in terms of this graphic and how we can sort of travel among the emotions. It's important, I guess, at this point, because we're going to get into personality in the next chapter, to identify the terms trait and state. And we will often use those terms. We might say, I have an emotional state, or have personality traits, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Now, that state and trait, those words are used in psychology to describe things that are fluid, state. So we have states of consciousness, and we have emotional states. And then we have traits, which tend to be consistent over time. So personality traits and intelligence traits, those kinds of things those are supposed to be sort of consistent. So there's a sort of ebb and flow of what do we include in emotions and what do we include in personality. And it actually serves as the definition for personality and emotions, those things that change a lot, dynamically based on the circumstances that someone is in. Those we tend to categorize as more emotional states, and those kinds of behaviors associated with that will end up acting in similar ways regardless of the situation that we're in. We call those states because they're stable over time. So at this point, we're looking at states, emotional states, motivation states. These are in the moment, very, very zen in their quality of them. We experience emotions and motivation in the here and now. So the first kind of concept after just talking about emotions is this concept that has arisen within the last 20 years or so in psychology that we call emotional intelligence. Now, emotional intelligence is essentially our skill level, probably a trait. The emotional intelligence is a trait on how we manage emotional states. Okay, so it talks about managing our emotions, understanding others' emotions and how it affects them, understanding our own emotions, using emotions to get things done, being able to motivate people and whatnot, perceiving emotions in other people, sort of understanding and managing those and understanding where people are. That this is a skill, this is a set of skills, a set of traits that an individual can develop that is actually more highly associated with success than intelligence, IQ type intelligence, or any one of the. Now, certainly someone has to have a skill set in order to be successful in anything, but emotional intelligence, working with other people and understanding the role that emotions play, is a very, very important. In fact, as I just said, it's more highly correlated with success than IQ. Now, success is defined very widely here. Success in relationships, success in business, success in your job, success at school. All of those seem to be related to emotional IQ, or EQ, as we like to talk about it. So In the course book, there's a little test that you can take to measure your EQ. And again, these are playful tests. They're online. They're not official, psychometric tests about emotional intelligence. And they're really meant for just insight and thinking about where you're at in terms of your emotions, emotional intelligence. Now, we ask then ourselves, well, how do I improve that? How do I go to school and I learn things and I practice learning skills and those kinds of things to increase my intelligence. How do I increase my emotional intelligence? And that's what I'm going to go through at this point. So here we have emotional intelligence, and what does it take? What do we need to do to make them better? And the first one is we observe how other people react. We become observers of our world around us, and we take notes. We try to understand things. We try to understand people at a different level rather than simply reacting. Put yourselves in other people's shoes. This is, what would I do in that situation? But it's more than that. What would I do in this situation simply places you in that situation within your own emotional reactions in history. Much better if you can place yourself in that person's shoes and try to understand things from their perspective, their history, their social expectations, their perspective. That perspective taking is not what would I do, it's a deeper understanding of if I was them, can I understand their actions? And if I don't understand their actions, chances are I don't understand them. I don't get that person and what their motivation is for particular actions. Slow down when you are judging. Keep from judging, particularly when people act in certain ways. Typical situation, somebody cuts you off, and there's lots of reactions that you can have while you're driving your car. But you kind of like, okay, wait, before I kind of assume that I know what's going on in this person's life, I have no evidence really, I don't know much except that they cut me off. Maybe they are a jerk, but maybe they're on their way to someplace really important, or they're distracted, or being able to slow down that process of judgment when somebody does something, particularly when it's like a personal offense. If somebody says something that quote unquote offends you, rather than jumping to the conclusion as to where that person may or may not be coming from, it is more successful to be able to say, okay, wait, let me try to understand where this person is coming from and why they're saying that, what is their motives, maybe asking them questions about that before we come to those conclusions that they may be, attacking us in any sort of way. Another way is, do you do things at work for attention? Now, this would be considered a behavior that someone with low emotional intelligence is getting in. Although if you're looking for a promotion, you kind of do things to make sure people understand your skill level, but it's a slightly different dynamic when you're doing that at a high EQ level versus when you're doing that at a low EQ level. Practice humility. Yeah, that kind of sits on its own, doesn't it? And we have help others shine. This is actually a very, very important aspect of leadership. Leadership is not promoting yourself and your own place and your own accomplishments. Leadership really is, and emotional intelligence really is recognizing people around you that have supported your success. Raise them up. And truthfully, it's a great way for you to achieve your own success, is to actually raise up the success and point out others' contributions to your success, and being part of humility as well. Do the self-evaluation. This is that quiz. Get some feedback from that little test that you can take, and what does it teach you? Even though it's not completely psychologically valid, these playful tests that we can engage in, they're good for just reflecting on yourself and the kind of work in progress that you are. Again, that humility of rather than if you get results that are unpleasant, it's not like, oh, that test is is not real. It's like, well, the test results were here, so what is this teaching me about me and these particular situations that are demonstrated in these quiz questions? So just always a good practice to do self-evaluation like that. Evaluate how you react under stress. This is a sign of where the rubber meets the road, right? It's okay to be calm in calm waters, but can you be calm when it's stormy? Can you navigate those and understanding your reactions and seeing what that does? You might be in stormy waters and feel threatened, so you might be overreacting and judging other people's behaviors. They're on my side, they're not on my side, and those kinds of behaviors are the ones to address in order to enable yourself to be able to make it through a storm of any kind. Take responsibility for your behavior and for your actions and for your results. Learn to apologize when you're wrong, no matter what level you're at, no matter what level in the family, at work, with your friends. If you've done something wrong, apologize. There's in fact, not only is there no shame in apologizing, there's shame in not apologizing. You're taking responsibility for your behaviors and saying, I was wrong, I misunderstood that. And that is really, really an important part of building character, which is a lot of what emotional intelligence is about. Analyze how your actions impact others. Again, not only watching other people to see how they react to emotional situations, but how do people react to you, and being aware of those so that you can make adjustments. Now, that brings us to one of the modern things that are going on right now, and that is, of course, Black Lives Matter and the raising consciousness of black life within America and institutionalized racism, continued problems related to redlining, to police brutality, to targeting black and brown individuals, and part of the emotional intelligence literally part of the work that I am doing personally as I'm learning about these things as a white guy, learning about these things is a really essential practice of my own emotional intelligence and really working on accepting ideas that are foreign to me because I'm not black and that I don't understand what living in America being black is, and being able to refrain from the feeling of judgment or judging myself because I really essentially don't know what this experience is. So remaining open to the information as it's coming in. And it can be challenging to viewpoints and ideas of reality that I've held my entire life. And this is really kind of the bleeding edge of this issue right now. What it also enables us to do is to understand the kind of fear and anger that exist within the black population, but also within everybody, with this fear of losing our understanding of what our world is like, fear of losing our understanding of what history really was, fear for our own safety, anger about not understanding these things or not being understood, and understanding these feelings. And sometimes we of course, we've seen in the news, sometimes this has created a boiling point, and that has been released in violence and destruction. And certainly that's not the goal, is to create violence and destruction. But again, I have to realize that I don't understand what it's like to live generation after generation with these kinds of circumstances that target me because of my skin color. I'm completely unaware of those on a personal level. On an intellectual level, kind of get your head wrapped around it. And this is one of those practices of emotional intelligence. An individual who is not subject to the kind of circumstances that black people have when they're living in America, has to use emotional intelligence for perspective taking, meaning not what I would do in that situation, but trying to understand what that individual did in that situation and why, and the motivation, and looking at the history and doing those kinds of things, as well as refraining from judging the circumstances that we see until we understand more. Remember, we're always seeing things through the media filter, good or bad. The whole story is never presented. I don't care which side of the media argument you're on. We never really get the full story. And therefore, we really need to refrain from judging, from drawing conclusions, because we weren't there. We're not understanding the situation. It's, for many of us not, or for me, that's just for me, I don't understand fully what the circumstances were. And I have to admit, I don't understand all the facts. I don't get all the facts. So remaining open to that is really an exercise of emotional intelligence. And that's kind of why I put this subject matter in here, not to justify individual actions. There's no cause, there's no justifiable cause for destroying something, hurting someone, those kinds of things, the kinds of rhetoric that we hear sometimes. There is, however, a psychological understanding as to why people may be inclined to do that when they're incredibly frustrated, incredibly angry, and seem to have no way, no recourse, and just completely frustrated. And to be able to slow ourselves down a little bit so that we can understand another person's point of view, that we'll attempt to understand another person's point of view that we never really will understand because we're not them. And I guess you can apply that to everybody. You can apply that to all of the different populations that experience discrimination and whatnot. But you can also apply it to your kids and to your spouse and to your friends and coworkers and your boss. Like, we're not them. So emotional intelligence is really the restraining of our immediate, quick first action, first impulse emotional states, and reeling those in so that we can think things out more clearly. So that's my message for that. Now, when we slip over to motivation, it's really hard to talk about motivation without talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, probably the most famous model within psychology, because it's used in psychology and in many, many other areas. Now, what we're now talking about, as I unceremoniously switched from emotion to motivation, what we're talking about is what makes us act. Now, much of this can be emotionally based. That's the energy source. But Maslow provides us with a model that says these are the things that draw us through behaviors to meet particular needs. And we learn through our socialization process how to meet these needs. Or we learn ways that actually are not successful in meeting these needs, and that creates anxiety, frustration, and a sense of lack of accomplishment. So just looking at this particular motivational theory, what Maslow proposes is that we have a hierarchy, meaning there's lower needs and there's higher needs. That's important to recognize from Maslow's point of view, is we are all striving for self-actualization. So rather than viewing this as, I need to accomplish this step, and then this step, and then the next step, and whatnot, although it's useful to use it that way too, understand that what Maslow said is human beings seek transcendence. They seek meaning. They seek what he called self-actualization, and he actually used the word transcendence, that we are drawn to that. So this is more like a vacuum that's pulling us through physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, almost like lessons that we need to learn on our way to self-actualization and transcendence. So physiological needs, you can see those safety needs, love and belonging, we see that that's before esteem. So our actual sense of self and self-perception really rest on our relationships, which is sort of dovetails with what I teach in sociology when we talk about the looking glass self and this committee of individuals that we have that we perform for. They're the individuals that we, in our own minds, use as our judges. What will mom think? What will Jesus think? What will my boss think? These kinds of things. And we imagine ourselves, and we're using those close relationships. And as long as they're based on love and belonging, are adaptable for us. They're very good. They're very good for us to have role models and people that hold us to expectations. And it's a very healthy way in which to self-monitor our own behavior. Now, this particular theory resonates with many people, in terms of, I use this theory kind of just as a philosophy in social work that I really, when I was doing an assessment, I would definitely assess things in this order. How are things going physiologically? Do you have food? Do you have safety? Do you have medical care? Do you have a place to be? Those kinds of things. Are you safe? Are you right in danger? Do you need medical help? Those kinds of things. What about friends in your social circle? What are you doing in terms of building yourself and hopefully transcending into self-actualization? It was interesting, however, in my career in rehab that there's a movement called Work First. Now, I worked with persons with chronic pervasive mental illness, and when I first began in my career, it was like, wow, how can this person who really is simply learning how to dress, how to clean themselves, learning basic ADLs, how can we even imagine that person, quote unquote, ready for work? But the work first mentality was very much in line with Maslow. When you create the expectation, let's say someone gets a job, it is the responsibility associated with that job that will draw them up to that job. So think of it just like self-actualization draws us through those things. Meaning, if I'm an individual with a chronic pervasive mental illness, and I don't have anything to do today, what motivates me to get up, take care of myself? Nothing. However, if I have a job to go to, where people are expecting me to do something, that will draw me to do the things that I need to do to be ready to perform. So it completely turned my perspective around that work-first mentality. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't try to address, as social workers, we don't try and address those things, but we say, now that you have a job, if that person's really connected to that work, then I don't necessarily have to convince that individual or work very hard. I can just simply, this is what you need to do, simply educating the individual about what the expectations of that social place are, the workplace. So, this is what they're saying you need to do. Do you need any help getting these things done? The motivation's there because they want to go to the job. So very, very important transition in my own personal philosophy in my career. Now let's look at some other motivations, and that has to do with the motivational theories associated with achievement. Now, there are different levels of achievement motivation. Some are learned. We learn to do certain things that we associate with achievement. We have social motives in terms of recognition and the benefits that come from our society in terms of rewards. Power and control over situations, those are part of our achievement motivation. Affiliation, I want to be, there's the wannabes. I want to be a nurse. I want to be, because I like those individuals. I want to be a member of that group. We definitively have a fear of failure, and that's part of motivation. In fact, the fear of failure, kind of an area that I've done some reading on, is an important part of motivation, an important part of success. Anybody who's participated in athletics knows that if you remove the score, you play less well. If you're working to win and there's a clear potential that you're going to lose, you're going to run faster, try harder, kick harder, throw further, each one of these things, because there is a potential of failure. When we remove the realness of failure, we run into lethargy. I'm just going to do the minimum. I'm not failing anyway. And we see that manifest in the grand failure of, let's say, an economic theory like communism didn't work, primarily because there was essentially not a whole lot of fear of failure, not a whole lot of motivation to change either. And so those kinds of things on a large scale tend to not work very well. But we also see it when people engage in their own work. Now, the fear of failure can also become so overwhelming that an individual can engage in self-handicapping, I can't do this, and or procrastination. Now, it seems a little odd that procrastination is associated with fear of failure, but you have to look at this again, that perspective taking, understanding why somebody would not do something. And we have to compare the results. If somebody is fearful of failure, meaning they have put effort into it and failed, meaning I wrote the paper, gave it my best shot, and I still did not get a passing grade on that. What that does, when somebody actually fails in the process of doing something, it is in a sense, condemnation of their behavior. It highlights where they're at. It's a hit to the self-esteem. I thought I was a good writer. I thought I put a lot of work into this. It's very disappointing. And that mix of emotions is they have to deal with that. Now, if an individual, however, has those same expectations but doesn't deliver, simply doesn't run the race, doesn't submit the paper, they get a 0 grade, but it is not a condemnation of their actual skill level. They can still logically say, had I submitted something, I probably would have got a good grade. I just didn't do it. And you can see that might actually be easier for the person to deal with than facing the reality that their skill level is not up to snuff. And so when we look at a problem, a behavioral problem, not a personality trait, people are not procrastinators. They procrastinate. It's a verb. It's not a noun. And so here we have, when we engage in this kind of behavior, we have to reflect upon what is the possibilities of doing this work and experiencing failure as a defining measure of where I am at in terms of that skill level, and embracing failure as a way of growth and learning. And that moving that process, so you're going to get it done because you want the opportunity to fail or succeed, and determine where you are in that skill level in this journey of, let's say, education or work or wherever this is being applied. So, okay, for this particular chapter, turning into a long lecture here, we have Chapter 10 discussion on Black Lives Matters, and a quiz where I'm asking you to first go and take the EQ little quiz, and also reflect upon your own motivation, looking at those factors that we have, such as social motives, learned motives, those kinds of things that we have that contribute to our motivations. They're looking at those. They're simply, why are you in school? Let's say you want to be a line worker. What are the learned motives, social motives, affiliations? Talk about procrastination. Talk about fear of failure. Talk about any one of those characteristics on there to answer that particular question. Okay, moving right along, we are now into chapter 11, where we're going to be talking about personality. Now, just as I said before, personality is a trait. That's what we talk about when we're referring to personality, are things that are consistent over time. Very different than the world we were just in, which is emotions and motivation. We have long been asking the question, who am I? What are the characteristics that make me a unique human being? Why do I do the things that I do? It's deeply embedded in the history of psychology, primarily looking at aspects of personality even before we use that term, trying to explain behavior. But sadly, most of it has been primarily focused on negative behaviors. If people are acting okay, and I think about the ancient world even, if people were acting okay, I mean, there was still an interesting conceptual process, such we have the thinker here on my screen, just contemplating who am I and why do I do the things that I do. But as this became institutionalized in our society, the focus is, what do we do and how do we understand these individuals who do not seem to be able to play the normal social games that we have lined up, the persons with mental illness or the persons with other forms of behavior that were not conducive to survival. So that focus of energy, just doctors rarely, even today, study healthy people. They tend not to show up for appointments. They're off doing their life. And so the focus has much been on trying to understand negative personality and like not positive personality traits and behaviors. So we can never, as I look at the history of this, we can never underestimate the importance that Charles Darwin had on the birth of an understanding of human personality. In 1859, he published his infamous work on the origin of species and presented that certain traits were selected through natural selection for survival in order for that species to survive and thrive. So certain traits are quote unquote desirable and certain traits are not. And they will be in the natural world, those will over time be sort of breeded out, and the optimization of the organism will continue happening in response to changes in the environment and further environmental selection of particular traits. Now, applying this to human beings was not necessarily Charles Darwin's idea. That actually was a lot more Francis Galton, who was actually Charles Darwin's cousins, a whole family of very, very bright people, did a lot in terms of this idea of desirable and undesirable traits and who should have kids and how do we get rid of all these negative traits and advance the human species, and actually introduced the world to the, or at least promoted the idea of eugenics, which is the study of selective breeding in human beings in order to select particular traits. Now, this did not, of course, fall on good ears, except for Adolf Hitler, who had copies of all of Francis Galton's work. It was very inspirational to him and his. But there's also continued thought about the notion of negative human traits and what we do those. I mean, we're seeing, in terms of the ethics of genetic engineering, we start to think, well, when do we cross a line, let's say, and we're actually selecting traits for removal, kind of thing. And, what are those traits and what decision making is going in there? And there's actually a certain degree of, I wouldn't call it eugenics, but certainly selection when we're looking for a partner in life. When we think about, if we think logically about when we're looking for a partner and that individual will help us have children, Well, what characteristics do we want that person to have? So then when the two of us combine, we're going to produce good kids, kind of thing. And we select, and there's a well-studied list of characteristics that we look at. So eugenics, bad news, bad applications, interesting concepts, but certainly as moral human beings, we don't approach our own, quote, evolution on those terms. So what Charles Darwin did introduce is survival, the basic concept that one of the chief motivations shared by all human beings is the concept of survival. And I want to place that in context with human instincts for survival, and these create drives and behavior. And this is the context where the infamous Sigmund Freud grew up and developed his theories, one of the first theories of personality, where he applied instincts and drives to the human experience. What he created was a model of the human personality that is still with us today, still a very big part of our vernacular. We use his terms all the time, even though this particular model is sort of lost favor in terms of an accurate portrayal of the personality. And what I'm talking about is this concept of levels of consciousness and the different parts of the personality. Now, ultimately, Freud saw the personality as driven, as I will show, by the id for basic survival, to pass my genes on to the next generation, very similar to that which drives in the animal kingdom. It's a reductionist theory in terms of human will and our control of these particular situations, because Freud really came at this from a point that we're not really aware of some of these animalistic type qualities to us that drive our behavior beyond our consciousness. So he first had to conceive this notion that we are fundamentally unaware of many aspects of our own personality. These aspects of personality drove his treatment to be focused on dream interpretation, free association, observation of the behavior. So unwittingly, we reveal the dark depths of our real animalistic tendencies and personality through the images in our dreams, through the words that come to us, those quick shot sort of things. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word father or car or something like that? And that immediate reaction. Rorschach ink blots, those sort of images we see, those are under the same sort of theory, that would draw out these unconscious motives and whatnot. And that's where Freud went with his particular treatment modality, psychoanalysis. But his personality theory is demonstrated in this, depicted in this particular graphic, and I'm going to go through it with you. Here we have the levels of consciousness here, and there's 3 levels. Conscious, these are the things that we're aware of. The pre-conscious level is we're sort of aware. They might slip out every once in a while. This is when we act in a certain way and we go, why was that? And we figure it out and like, oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. We're somewhat aware, but not always aware. And then there's the unconscious level. Now, I want you to notice the graphic of the personality itself is the iceberg that's sitting in this water, and the water level is the preconscious level. That's the thin surface of the water here. And you notice that there's aspects of each part of the personality that are below our consciousness. So the entire id is below our consciousness. A bunch of the superego is in the unconscious, and the rest remains in the preconscious, sometimes peeking up into the conscious level. And then we have the ego itself, which is our, kind of our sense of I, or sense of self. So let's look at these. We have the id, is the basic impulses, sex and aggression, seeking immediate gratification, irrational impulses, operates at the unconscious level. The The superego, these are what we learn over time. So Freud's developmental theory is actually the development of the superego. That the id, as a baby, encounters the rules and regulations associated with our society, and there's a battle that goes on that actually builds the superego. And as consciousness and awareness develops over time, we have an id that can actually watch and see and experience this particular battle between the id and the superego. This is our ideals, our morals, striving for perfection, and then our ego. This is our executive function. We mediate between id impulses and superego inhibitions. We're testing reality. It's rational. It operates primarily in the conscious level, but also in the preconscious level. Now we can see this as a very sort of neat depiction of the way in which we experience our personality. Sometimes we do things and we're like, where'd that come from? Or we may have desires that are really not okay, in terms of society's norms and whatnot. So where is this coming from? And this was simply a description of that sort of experience. And sort of Freud took it quite to a degree. So we can actually still use this theory, if not playfully, we can say, here's Gronk in one of my favorite Disney movies of all time, The Emperor's New Groove. And he has the id depicted by the devil on one shoulder and the superego, the good angel, on the other shoulder. And he's the ego. And so this is really that angel on one side, superego, devil on one side, id, and you're the ego kind of in this kind of debate about taking actions, is really a playful and pervasive depiction of what Freud talked about. Now, in Freud's clinical theory, and when he talked about, remember we're looking at abnormal personality, where individuals, he felt their id impulses were incredibly powerful, and there was an anxiety that occurred within the individual that their id impulses would overpower the superego restraints, and therefore they acted in ways that were out of the norm in order to suppress or divert those energies. And he called those mechanisms defense mechanisms. And so that is a study in and of itself. Take the personality class, goes right into all of the relationship, this logical relationship that is very descriptive but less prescriptive. This is a theory that doesn't necessarily lend itself to ready intervention, such as skill development and whatnot, in order to improve your life. But it is a very useful tool for analyzing kind of processes that are going inside of yourself when you're feeling conflicted. For example, you can look, well, there's things I want, there's what society wants, and I'm supposed to do this, but I want to do this. Everybody understands that reality. Everybody understands Gronk's perspective here as he's contemplating his next action. There's good and bads, weighing pros and cons, those kinds of things. Now, after Freud, a student of Freud by the name of Carl Jung was really focused on not so much the personality, but what's in this water picture from Carl Jung's perspective, there were all these icebergs floating in an ocean, and what's in the ocean? What's there that we're sharing? Like there's aspects of the ocean that connect with other icebergs and globally. And he called that the collective unconscious. And so his work, here's a picture of him, focused on what is at this depth. And he started to explore areas that we now refer to in depth psychology related to the personality, the collective unconscious. That within there are archetypes. There are representations of ideals such as mom, dad, woman, man, fear, emotions. those kind of things, that these creatures, let's say, are models. The term archetypes is hard to define without using the words arc, meaning pinnacle types. They're ideals of our human experience. There's also symbols that exist within there that have meaning across different cultures. The personality types were collections of these ideals that we thought for, and that led to the modern use of Carl Jung's theory in the Myers-Briggs type inventory. Now, depth psychology is, again, another field of psychology. It's not really on the edge of things, in terms of psychology is really focused on biopsychology right now and brain imaging and whatnot. But it's an interesting area that takes a look at shared experiences of human beings. Why, for instance, everywhere in the world, the symbol of a circle has very similar meanings across cultures, across history, even when those cultures have not met or collaborated together. Why is that? And looking at and he kind of introduced the notion at a professional level of dream interpretation based on these particular symbols. And so the symbolic representations in dreams that may at least start a really interesting conversation may be indicators of inner conflicts that somebody's not really aware of. So dream interpreters working at this level will often use the symbolic representations that Carl Jung and others created, dream dictionaries that look at the objects and provide them with an existential meaning. So if you're in a house, for example, the house is a house, and it has its own, evident prevailing meaning within the dream, but it also has symbolic meaning, and usually that's of the personality. It's you're the house, a house of many rooms and hallways, and rooms that are open and rooms that are locked. And as you venture through, it changes the discussion about the dream in a way that helps the individual explore aspects of their personality. Now, interestingly enough, the personality types that are created by archetypes within the theory of Carl Jung led to the development of the Myers-Briggs personality type inventory, which measures aspects of a personality on 4 dimensions. One is introversion versus extroversion. Where do I get my energy? What kind of activities do I like? Sensing versus intuition. Sensing is the data gathering individual to draw decisions. Intuition is the gut reaction individual to make decisions. Thinking and feeling is the use of logic in order to understand the world, where feeling is, it's kind of heart and head, kind of what are driving people's emotions and actions. And finally, perceiving and judging. And perceiving is the individual looks at things more globally and kind of the what's the word here? I'm not going to get it. I'm having a brain moment right here in the middle of the video. I'm trying to think. Gestalt, that's it. Kind of like the whole. Looking at things, what is the meaning in this? A judging individual, remove the word judge in terms of judgmental. That's not what this means at all. The judging individual, very ordered. Okay, someone's on a holiday and you're there with a perceiving person. They're like, okay, let's see what's going on. Let's there's something, let's go over there. Let's go, go to Disney and there's something over there. Let's do this. The judging individual has a plan. That's that kind of different personality traits there. So here we have these 4 areas. When we take the Myers-Briggs and we answer questions, usually in dichotomies, would you do this or this? Would you prefer doing this or this? That's the way the questions go. what we get is 4 letters. We either get an I or an E, or S or an N, a T and an F, T or an F, a P or a J. And let's say, for example, someone took this test and they got an ENTJ. That makes them an ENTJ, and they can look up the personality description of a person who's an ENTJ. Or we can look at a person who's an ISFP. The opposite, an ISFP. What does that look like? Now, the tools of the test provide us with a graphic of all the different combinations, 16 possible personalities. So we look at here in the ENTP. Which one? Yeah, it looks at ENTJ, the strategic directors, INTPs, expansive analyzers, ENFP, impassioned catalyst. Now, this is not the sum total of the descriptions. This is just a graphic representing some basic traits. There are books and books written about each one of these 16 personality traits. It's a very, very well used, well documented personality inventory for understanding yourself and how you interact with others, how you make decisions, how you like your environment, and how you like to make your way through your day. And so it's a very, very valuable tool. Here's the interesting thing about the Myers-Briggs. It actually has very little solid core evidence of being a valid personality test. Useful, no doubt. My interpretation of that particular concept is that when you take the Myers-Briggs, the first time I took the Myers-Briggs, it was during a training, and I took the Myers-Briggs. They said, consider yourself at work when you're doing this, because it was for a workplace development. Not at home, not with your friends, not on vacation. Answer these questions using that hat, that work hat. And then we can answer the questions with my friends. I answer the questions, and there might be similarities. It's personality, so there's supposed to be some, traits that are going there. And I discovered if I take the test at work, I'm extroverted. If I take the test and I'm modeling myself at home, I'm introverted. So it's not that it's measuring my personality as a static thing. It's what I've learned are the ways that I survive in particular different environments, and they may change. For many people they don't, but for me they changed based on whether I was at work or whether I was at home. That's sort of the limitation of it, but almost endlessly fun and useful to take. It's interesting to take this test and have your partner take it. I one time assigned this for someone to take the test. They enjoyed it so much. They brought it. They were a member of a small congregation church. He brought it to his pastor. The whole church took it in this whole exploration. It's kind of interesting to look at that application. But they did that, and they had a ball with it. Understanding how people operate, how they like to be communicated with, how much, what drives them, and what alone time versus together time, and all this stuff. And it turned actually into a rich process for that group of people. Very, very fun instrument to play around with. Now, along the lines of measuring personality traits, there have been many, many tests that have been created. And over the years, these tests have been analyzed, the actual tests themselves. And what has happened is we've discovered that even though there are tests that have 16 personality traits, maybe 27 personality traits, maybe they only have 6 personality traits, what we see is across all these different tests, there are 5 that continue to arise over and over. And we refer to them as the Big 5. Big 5 personality traits. And now there are tests, as I have for you to take, a Big 5 personality test. So the Big 5 personality test consists of neuroticism, extroversion, we already talked about that, openness to experience, agreeableness, and finally conscientiousness. So these characteristics considered the Big 5 personalities. These are the characteristics that are often used for matchmaking in dating sites and whatnot. And this is along the idea that birds of a feather flock together. I'm looking for someone like me. They have the same level of conscientiousness. They're agreeable, openness to new experiences or not. We're looking for matches for wherever our personality is. And they're using, even though it might be hidden behind some of those other questions, they're using this test to create those matches. Now, in this particular graphic, it's a little out of order, but if you want to remember these, the acronym is OCEAN. So openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So interesting way to keep each one of those in mind. Now that brings us to the final assessments for this week. We have a chapter 11 discussion on Freud and a quiz where I'm asking you to take the Big 5 personality test. All right, so that's a long session here. Have a good week, and I will see you in the discussion boards, and have fun with these. We have the emotional intelligence test, and we have the Big 5. These are self-exploratory. There's no wrong answers. Just enrich self-perception. Share those. Share them with your family. Share them with your coworkers. This is fun stuff and good psychology. So I will see you later.